G'day guys, welcome to another video. Today we're going to look at lesson 12. That thing will unhighlight, whatever. So we're looking at lesson 12 today. So this is what we call the nature versus nurture debate. It is, you may have heard of it before, but it's the idea that, if we can summarize it, is are you born who you are and nothing can sort of affect that? Everything, all the decisions you make are due to genetics, your genes, all the hereditary sort of things passed down from you, both physical, mental, and cultural. That's the sort of nature argument. Whereas the nurture argument is the idea that it's the environment around you that influences who you become. You're not necessarily born with certain predispositions, although you may be, but how they're shaped is predominantly due to, say, things like how your parents raise you, the influences of your society and culture around you, and things like that. So it's this idea of which has more influence over our identity formation and socialization processes. So if you go to page 32, make sure you highlight that and date it, and we'll get started. I'll just make sure that's in a good position. Position's short for position, in case you're not as up to date with the slang as we are. Alright, so page 32. Here we go. So, firstly, what I would like you to do before we start is get 2 concept cards out. You will need them. I would love you guys to create a concept card on nature and a concept card on nurture. Now, how I would like you guys to do that is, once you've read through this and filled the word bank in, and then read the nurture word bank and filled that in, then I want you to put a definition on that as a concept card. Okay. So what is nature versus nurture, and why is it a debate? So the debate's pretty much on the extent of whether we inherit most of our behaviors and things that shape identity, or whether we learn them through growing up. So that's the main debate that we're having here. So remember at the start I talked about what nature is. If I go in a bit more detail here, nature are things like your DNA, your eye color, how tall you are, how short you are. Your sex at birth is determined by nature. And a lot of what people are thinking as well is that nature determines much of your personality, and that's kind of influenced by things like your hormones. So for example, men typically, and of course this is a generalization, but there's evidence to back it up, is that men are typically more aggressive than women. Women are typically more mature than men. So these ideas are influenced by the nature of your genes and genetics and your hormones that are different between the sex of male and female. And a lot of that's determined by nature. Whereas if we go to nurture, these are things like the values and beliefs that our parents have raised us with, how your peers may influence certain things like how you dress and you speak. We consider those nurture aspects. So they're things that we're not necessarily born with, but that we acquire over time as a result of the environment that we grow up in. So you might be wondering, why don't we just accept that both can be correct, that we have some elements of nature and some elements of nurture? And that's still a position that many people take, but the debate itself is more on which has more impact on your identity formation. And there's a lot of research that backs up the idea that nature is the predominant factor, but then there's also, on the other hand, a lot of social research that says that nurture is the predominant feature. And so 2 key experiments that we've got here to look at that are some videos. So this is a very famous one that talks about how nurture is the more important or influential of the 2 factors growing up. And this is called Harlow's monkey experiment. So I'll put this link in the description. But it's a very interesting video. It was done many years ago, hence the black and white. Now, of course, this sort of experiment we wouldn't consider ethical so much these days, especially according to social and cultural research principles that we look at. But watch this and see sort of the effects that nature and nurture has on this monkey growing up. So the idea behind this video, you'll watch it in a second, but this guy called Harlow, he put a monkey in a cage, and he gave them sort of two mothers, one that really reflects nurture, one that reflects nature. And the idea was he wanted to see which mother, the nature mother or the nurture mother, the monkey would go to under different scenarios. So have a look at that. It's a really good video which sort of explores nurture there. And then the second one here is about nature. And this video is more aligning the fact that nature is more influential of the two. Okay, and so they do an experiment on children in the first, and it's nothing bad or illegal there. And then they follow the same experiment on chimpanzees, and what they end up finding is, so they give them sort of different toys, and the idea is which toy does the kid gravitate towards, and that's the idea of nature. Now, we might say, oh yeah, but they've been raised 2 or 3 years being told that they're a boy or a girl, and they identify with certain things. But that's when they transition the experiment to chimpanzees, and it's very interesting to see what the male and female monkeys do with each of those toys, given the fact that we as humans haven't influenced them with our culture. So look at both of those videos. Once you have, answer the following question on which experiment you think is more convincing, the nature or nurture experiment, and why. So I want you to pick one that you think is the most convincing, that has the most sort of evidence. If you think it's one or the other, put that in. If you're sitting on the fence and you think it's both, maybe you'll have to write that answer in your big boy book, because you probably need more than 4 lines to answer that. But if you find that you find one experiment more convincing than the other, write it down and tell me why. Make sure you use all 4 lines there. What I would like you to do then now is, what we have here is a table. So list the following things. So sorry, pause the video, watch those videos there, and then answer that question. Now that you've done that, question 2 is list the following things into a nature or nurture table and justify your choices. So you've got 5 choices here. You have, or areas, you have intelligence, so how smart that you deem someone to be, how smart or clever they are. Personality, so things like who you are, whether you're happy, whether you're sad, whether you're funny, what sort of characteristics do you have that form and shape part of your personality. I want you to consider that. Your sexuality, so whether you are into men, women, both, neither, or whatever the case may be. Talent, the idea of talent here is things that you're really good at. So if you're really good at playing guitar, or you're a really good singer, or you're really good at a certain sport, or you feel like you're predisposed to certain skills and traits, that's what we mean by talent. And beliefs are things like, do you follow a certain religion? Even beliefs outside of religion, like do you believe in freedom of speech? Do you believe everyone should have a fair go? Do you believe that you should get paid for the amount of hours that you work? Do you believe that it should be minimum wage? So beliefs is quite large, as we can see. So what I want you guys to do is write whether you think, say, intelligence is more influenced by nature or nurture. And then I want you to write it in there. So you're only going to have one thing in each box. So let's say, for example, you just think intelligence is something that you're born with. Let's say you think personality is something you are, that's more shaped by your cultural influences around you in the environment you grow up. So I want you to list whether you think it goes in nature or nurture for all of them. Now, there's no right or wrong answer here. I don't want you guys to get caught up trying to think that. I think it's based on your opinion, and because the case can be argued for both, for any of them, to be honest. And then I want you here to justify why you have put it in that certain table. So say you put intelligence in nature, write your justification as to why you think it belongs in nature as opposed to nurture. Okay, so pause this video and get that done now. Now that you've done that, with everything we've sort of looked at so far in this lesson about nature and nurture, what I would like you to consider is the following scenario. Okay? A baby is crying in the middle of the night. The child has just been fed, but as one of the parents gets up to see to the child, so see to the child to help them out, because they're crying, to see and check if they're okay, their partner says, "Don't spoil him, just let them cry themselves to sleep." Just let him cry himself to sleep. Make sure I get my grammar right there. So if you could actually adjust that there, that would be great. So with that scenario considered, so baby's crying, the child's just been fed, the parent gets up to see to them, and the other partner says, "No, don't spoil him, just let him cry himself to sleep." Do you think with that scenario that a baby can be spoilt through nurture? So the nurture being the parent going up to assist the child because they're upset and crying? Or do you think that nature and the idea of self-soothing should kick in? The idea that the baby's innate nature will be able to, and the crying is just a process they've got to get through, which will then help them to soothe themselves back to sleep without any nurture influence of the parent whatsoever. So, again, I want you to write what your thoughts and stance on that is. Do you think that nature or nurture is more, not necessarily more important, but which do you think would be the stronger influence in that scenario? Write what you think in those 4 lines there. Now again, no right or wrong answer. There's lots of research for either side. Just want to see you guys applying your knowledge here. And the idea is that I want you to be able to justify your reasoning. Okay, again, this all links back to HSC skills and things that we're doing, the ability to answer a question and back it up. Okay, that's really important. So pause that, do that now. Now you've done that. Question 3. To what extent is nature or nurture the most impactful, I don't like that word that I've used there. To what extent is the most influential? I like that better. So change that to influential if you can, please. So to what extent is nature or nurture the most influential force in the socialization process? So this question, you have to pick a side, okay? You may be on the fence for both, but for this question, I want you guys to pick a side and practice justifying it, okay? Because you may get a HSC question that gives you a really strong or. Sometimes they'll change that to and, which means you can talk about both, but if it's or, and it's in capital letters here, you pick one. And they may even frame the question why. They might say justify whether nature or nurture is the most influential force, okay? But here we have to what extent. So I want you to highlight that. That's sort of our verb. Now, to what extent means is that you need to give evidence to the degree to which something is. So if we were to reframe it, you could say how much. So how much is nature or nurture the most influential? But when you're saying how much, pretty much and essentially what you're doing is you are making a judgment, okay? So above to what extent you can write make a judgment on whether nature or nurture is the most influential, okay? So you are in effect evaluating and making a judgment in that regard. Now it would be good within your answer that you say the extent to which nature is the most influential force is staggering, or it's huge, or whatever it is. Use that wording in the question where you can. So what you'll then need to do is follow your Peel paragraph structure, okay? Make your point, give your example and evidence, explain it, and then link it back to the question. So the idea here is that you should have enough space here to write one Peel paragraph which addresses that question, okay? So think about what you've learnt this past lesson, what we've explored here with these different experiments. You guys have already been putting nature or nurture and your own spin on it with smaller questions, and now the test here is to do it with a bigger question. Now again, of course, if you have any questions about it, you can definitely come and see me, and I'll be happy to help. I'll just quickly break down the rest of the question for you. So that's to make a judgment. So I would underline or highlight whichever one you're going to pick, whether it's nature or nurture, and it's saying which is the most influential force in the socialization process. So here you need to, this is where you're giving examples of why nature or nurture is more or the most impactful. Okay, beautiful. So pause, do that now, and we've got one last thing to go. Now this very last section is about epigenetics. Now I haven't done a word bank here because it's a very, I guess, niche and new area of research. So what epigenetics is it's a form of, and it's a young form of science, and what it's doing is it's changing the nature, it's changing the nature of the nature versus nurture debate. What I guess some psychologists in recent years have been thinking about is that the question of how much behavior is produced by nature and how much is produced by nurture is the wrong question to be asking. And instead, what they're looking at is, rather than people sitting in the nature camp or the nurture camp and saying one's more influential than the other, what they're sort of trying to investigate is how they interact together, which to you may, make the most sense and be the most commonsensical approach. But beforehand, there wasn't as much evidence to show how they were linked. It was more nature influences this and nurture influences this. Now we've seen with some more research that they can do into our genes, and it's very interesting to see the differences there. So I guess an example of this, if you look at these two videos, it will explain it really well, but the idea of epigenetics is the fact that you can have what's called a nature gene within you. So let's say you have had 3 generations of obese grandparents, and then obese parents, and then obese kids, and that generation's gone for a cycle. Now, what is happening with your genes and your nature is the idea that gene is leaving you more. Now, it's not saying you definitely are, but you are more likely then, because you've had almost 3 generations of people being overweight in your family, that you are more than likely to have a gene that makes you more predisposed to gain weight easily. So that's the nature impact, and that's there. Now, where the nurture sort of impact comes in is that your environment can influence whether that gene gets switched on or off. So that gene's always going to be there, and there's nothing you can do to change that. And that's the epigenetic side of it. But whether it's turned on or it's turned off is the nature influence there. So, and another example, if we use the opposite, say from obese, and we use the idea of famine and anorexia, there was what was called the Dutch hunger winter during the last year of the Second World War. So what they found was that children who were in the womb during the famine experienced a lifelong increase in their chances of developing various health problems compared to children conceived after the famine. And so if you were conceived during that famine, and then years later when you had kids, obviously that weren't impacted by the famine, they were still more likely to experience health problems 2-3 generations later, because they had that gene there switched on, and it was present, but then over time nature or nurture impacts can help to switch that gene off. So the idea is that even with things like the smoking gene, so if you have a history of family and parents that smoke, you are more likely to then smoke as you grow up. Now, a lot of people, the old argument used to be, yeah, that's just because of nurture. You know, your parents smoked and they imparted those values and beliefs onto you that smoking was fine or whatever. But what epigenetics is finding is that there's actually DNA and cell imprinting when kids are born. And for lack of a better word, we'll call it the smoking gene, and we've got an image here. And that is going to make you more likely to smoke. But whether that's turned on or turned off is the idea and the influence that nurture can have. So what I would like you guys to do to get your head around this a bit better is watch both of these videos. This explains the difference between the two, and it looks at these twin studies, which is very interesting. And then after that, I would like you to watch this second video on epigenetics.
Grammarly helps you work more efficiently, which makes accomplishing...
and this sort of talks about those DNA bits that I was talking about, how you can have the smoking gene, but not necessarily. I think I took the still shot from here when it loads. Anyway, it's down here, so it's not necessarily important. But watch that, and what I want you to do now, and here's a little test to see if people are actually watching these videos or not. What I would like you to do is in your big boy book, get your big boy book out right now. So pause this if you have to get that out. Once you have got that out, I want you to write the following question, and I'm going to do it on a blank Word doc for you so you can copy it down. And I want you to write this down. So justify whether... So after you've researched all this stuff on epigenetics, I want you to justify whether epigenetics or nature versus nurture is more appropriate to use as a tool to measure our the socialization process. So use examples in your answer. So what I want you to do with this question is I want you to justify whether you think, so again, you've got to pick one or all, whether epigenetics, that sort of different take on nature versus nurture, or the old nature versus nurture debate, is more appropriate to use as a tool, not a toll, to measure the socialization process. So which do you think is a better way of looking at how these influences shape how we grow up? So this is just, I guess, a little question to test how many people are actually watching the videos or not. So write that question in your big boy book and answer it. There's going to be no specific line length or anything. I just want I want you to tell me essentially whether you think epigenetics or nature versus nurture debate is better as a tool to measure the impacts that certain things can have on our socialization process, and use an example in your answer to justify it. And you might use the gene example of how they interact together is more appropriate than viewing them in isolation. Okay, so once you've done that, that is the end of the video. If you have any questions throughout the week, make sure you come and see me. Bye-bye.